The letter didn't come by email. It came the old way in a heavy cream envelope with the Caldwell Group crest embossed on the back flap, slid under the door of Garrett Morrow's site office at 6 in the morning. Like whoever sent it didn't want to be seen doing it. He almost didn't open it. The coffee was still brewing. His daughter had woken up twice in the night with a bad dream, and he had a crew showing up at 7 to pour the foundation on the lakeshore extension. He had enough to carry before 8 a.m. without adding anything else to the pile. But something about the weight of the envelope stopped him. He set down his thermos and tore it open. The letter was short. 4 paragraphs. Language so clean and careful it could have been written by a machine, and maybe in some ways it was, because the Caldwell Group didn't send letters like this unless every word had been reviewed by at least 3 lawyers. The summary was simple. They were interested in acquiring his firm, Morrow Structural Inc., and they were prepared to offer $42 million for full operational transfer. A meeting had been scheduled for the following Thursday. His attendance was requested, not suggested. Garrett read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and stared out the rain-streaked window at the skeletal frame of the building, going up across the yard, the one his team had been working on for 11 months, the one that was supposed to prove they could compete at this level. $42 million. He had started Morrow Structural 7 years ago with a used pickup truck, a borrowed transit level, and $38,000 he'd scraped together after the divorce. Back then, Lily was 2 years old and barely sleeping through the night, and he was doing the same because the fear of failing her was louder than anything else in his life. He'd taken every job he could get, small residential builds, driveway repairs, a few commercial contracts that paid just enough to keep the lights on and the daycare bills current. He hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 years straight. Now they were doing $18 million infrastructure projects along the Ottawa River corridor. Now they had 41 employees and a reputation that had taken him most of the decade to build from nothing, and someone wanted to buy all of it for $42 million. He picked up the letter again. Read the 4th paragraph more carefully this time. Full operational transfer. Standard acquisition terms to be discussed at meeting. And there, almost invisible between the formalities, a single phrase that landed differently than the rest. All existing senior personnel subject to review and potential restructuring following close of transaction. He folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, walked out to meet the crew. He didn't tell anyone about it for 3 days. The Caldwell Group occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower on Elgin Street in Ottawa, the kind of building that announced itself before you even reached the door. Garrett had driven past it 100 times on contracts in the area without thinking much about it. Now he stood in its lobby in the same blazer he wore to city council presentations, watching the elevator numbers count down, and tried not to look like someone about to be weighed. He wasn't intimidated by money. He'd worked for wealthy clients his entire career. But there was a difference between a client with money and a company that had so much of it that the money itself had become a kind of gravity, pulling everything nearby into its orbit whether it wanted to be there or not. The boardroom on the 14th floor was built to remind you of that difference. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rideau Canal. A table that could seat 20, occupied by 5. And at the head of it, Lawrence Caldwell, 63 years old, silver-haired, the kind of calm that came not from peace but from a lifetime of never having to raise his voice to be heard. Beside him sat his daughter, Renata Caldwell Pierce, who ran acquisitions and was, from everything Garrett had quietly learned in the days before the meeting, the sharper of the two. The others were lawyers and a financial analyst who didn't introduce themselves. Lawrence stood when Garrett entered, extended a hand. "Mr. Morrow, we appreciate you making the time." The handshake was firm and brief, the kind designed to communicate authority without appearing to try. Garrett matched it. "I didn't have a lot of choice," he said, keeping his voice level. "You scheduled the meeting before I confirmed." A faint smile crossed Lawrence's face, more acknowledgement than apology. "We find that a confirmed meeting is easier to prepare for." Garrett sat down across from them and didn't say anything to that. The first 40 minutes were professional and thorough. They walked him through the offer structure, the valuation methodology, the projected integration timeline. Renata ran the numbers with a precision that was genuinely impressive. She knew his firms better than most of his own clients did. Revenue per project, average margin, retention rates, key personnel dependencies. She had done her homework, and then somewhere around the 50-minute mark, the tone shifted. It was Lawrence who shifted it. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the table with the ease of someone who had won this particular game many times before. "You've built something solid," he said, and his voice carried just enough generosity to feel like a concession. For the size of operation you've been running, the numbers are genuinely respectable. Garrett caught the word. For the size. He let it sit there. But there's a ceiling, Lawrence continued, almost gently. You know that. You've probably felt it this past year. The contracts you're not getting called for. The tenders you're submitting on but not winning. That's not a reflection of your quality. It's a reflection of your category. He paused, letting the distinction land. The Caldwell Group doesn't have those problems. And as part of our portfolio, neither would you. Renata added, not unkindly, our infrastructure division alone did $460 million last year. What we're offering you is an on-ramp to that scale. At the cost of operational authority, Garrett said. Operational integration, Renata corrected, smooth and precise. Standard for any acquisition of this type. Your term sheet says all senior personnel subject to review and potential restructuring. A brief silence. That's standard language, said one of the lawyers. It's also what happens to the people who have been with me since the beginning, Garrett said. He kept his voice even, but something had tightened in his chest that he didn't entirely recognize. My site manager has been on every major job we've done for 5 years. My project coordinator. 2 of my structural leads. They didn't take those jobs for the salary, they took them because they trusted where we were going. Lawrence studied him the way someone studies a problem they've already solved. We would of course consider retaining key talent where it aligns with. Consider, Garrett said. A pause. Consider, Lawrence confirmed. And that was when Garrett understood what this meeting actually was. Not a negotiation, a notification. They had already decided what they wanted and how they were going to get it. This meeting was the formality. The part where he was supposed to feel the weight of the number and agree that it was heavier than anything else in the room. His hand moved without thinking the way it sometimes did, dropping to the inside pocket of his blazer where his phone sat. He didn't pull it out. He just felt it there, and without trying to, he pictured the home screen. A photo he'd taken last autumn at the Gatineau Park lookout, Lily in her orange rain jacket, 7 years old, hair blown sideways by the wind, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware of being photographed, completely unaware of everything a photograph like that was supposed to mean. She called him a builder. She had since she was 4. Every time someone asked her what her dad did, she said, "He builds things. Not bridges, not buildings, just things. Like it was the most important work in the world." He looked back across the table. "I'll need to review this with my team," he said. Lawrence nodded, gracious in the way that powerful people could be when they already knew the outcome. "Of course. Take the week." Garrett stood, gathered the documents they'd provided, and shook hands with each of them in turn. When he shook Renata's hand, she held it half a second longer than necessary. "You've got something real here, Mr. Morrow," she said quietly. "Don't let pride be the thing that costs you." He smiled politely and didn't answer. The drive back to the site took 22 minutes. He spent most of it not thinking about the $42 million. He spent it thinking about the word consider and what it sounded like when someone used it to mean probably not. He told his team the next morning. He called them into the site office before the crew arrived, the 5 people who had been with him long enough to have the right to hear it first. Darren, his site manager, who had turned down a regional director role at a larger firm 4 years ago to stay with Garrett's outfit. Megan, his project coordinator, who ran logistics so precisely that she could tell you the rebar count on a job from 3 months ago without checking her files. Portia, who handled contracts and compliance and had once caught a clause in a municipal tender that saved them $200,000 in liability exposure. And Kwame and Teddy, his 2 senior structural leads, who between them had over 30 years of field experience and the kind of judgment that no hiring process could manufacture. He laid it out plainly, the offer, the terms, the timeline, the personnel clause. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Darren said, "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Garrett said. "That's why I'm telling you." Megan looked at the printout of the term sheet he'd passed around. "Full operational transfer. That means you wouldn't be running anything. Functionally?" "No. And us?" Quime asked. Garrett looked at him directly. "Subject to review. That's what they told me." Another silence. Portia set the term sheet down on the desk with a quiet, deliberate care that said more than words. Teddy leaned back and crossed his arms. "We've had a good year, Garrett. If we finish the Lakeshore contract on schedule and the Carlton bid comes through, we're looking at our best revenue year ever." "I know that. Then why are they coming to us now?" Garrett had thought about this. Because we're at the inflection point. Not big enough that buying us is complicated. Not small enough that buying us is pointless. We're exactly the size that's easiest to absorb before we become harder to absorb. The room sat with that. Darren said quietly, "You built this for Lily. It wasn't a question or a challenge. It was just a fact said out loud, the way you sometimes named a thing so it could be heard properly. And Garrett felt it land exactly the way Darren meant it to, right in the center of the thing he'd been circling around for 3 days without looking directly at. "Yeah," he said, "I did." He spent the next 4 days not sleeping. Not because he couldn't, or not entirely. More because the space between waking and sleeping was where the doubt lived, and he didn't want to leave it unattended. Because doubt without supervision had a way of making decisions on your own behalf. He ran the numbers 6 different ways. With the acquisition. Without it. With the Carlton contract. Without it. With 2 key hires. Without them. He modeled out scenarios that assumed good faith from the Caldwell Group and scenarios that assumed otherwise. Every time he ran the numbers with the acquisition, the result was the same. He'd be solvent, comfortable, and irrelevant to his own company within 18 months. He went for a run along the river at 5:30 in the morning on the 3rd day, the kind of dark that feels personal rather than just early. The Ottawa skyline cutting a pale orange strip above the tree line on the Quebec side. So he ran until his chest hurt in a way that was physical rather than metaphorical, and then he stopped at the Pretoria Bridge and stood there for a while, watching the water move. He thought about what Renata had said. Don't let pride be the thing that cost you. He turned it over. The thing was, it wasn't pride. He knew what pride felt like. He'd felt it in his worst moments, when he dug in on something because he couldn't stand being wrong rather than because he was actually right. This wasn't that. This was something quieter and harder to name. It was the awareness that what he had built carried other people in it. That the $42 million wouldn't flow to Darren and Megan and Kwame and Teddy and Portia. That the word consider was doing a lot of work in that term sheet, and it was doing it in one direction. He came home at 6:15 to find Lily already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas with a bowl of cereal she'd poured herself, very seriously arranging the pieces into a pattern before eating them. "You went running," she said, not looking up. "I did. In the dark. It's getting light." She considered this with the thoroughness of someone who isn't sure it's a satisfying answer. Then she said, "Are you worried about something?" He sat down across from her. She was 7. She noticed things the way children notice things, not through logic but through the body, the way a change in the temperature of a room registered before you could name why. "A little," he said, because lying to her felt worse than whatever the truth cost. She kept arranging her cereal. "Is it the building stuff?" "Yeah." "Is someone being mean?" He almost laughed. "Not exactly, they're being very polite." She looked up at him then with a precision that sometimes startled him. "That's worse," she said. He looked at her for a second. "Yeah," he agreed. "It kind of is." She pushed her bowl aside and reached for the piece of paper she'd been drawing on before the cereal. A half-finished sketch of what appeared to be a very large building with a tiny figure standing in front of it. She worked on it in silence for a moment, and Garrett sat with his coffee and let the kitchen be quiet, because it was one of the things about being alone with a child that nobody told you beforehand, that the quiet could hold you up if you let it. After a few minutes, she held up the drawing without looking at him. The figure in front of the building now had something next to it, a smaller shape, connected by a line she'd drawn carefully between them. "That's you and me," she said, "in front of your building." He took the drawing from her. The proportions were enormous, the way children drew things, the building vast, the 2 figures very small but very deliberate, connected by that careful line. Above it, in the large irregular letters she'd started using since September, she'd written, "We built it." He held it for a long moment without speaking. "We didn't build it together," he said finally, gentle. "You were 2 years old." She gave him the look she'd been perfecting lately, the one that said she found certain adult distinctions unpersuasive. "I know," she said, "but I was there." He put the drawing on the table and covered his face with one hand for a second, not because he was upset, but because he needed a moment to be somewhere the feeling couldn't be seen. Then he took a breath, picked the drawing back up, and looked at it again properly. She was right. She had been there. She'd been there in the $38,000 he'd refused to put in anything riskier than a business account because he couldn't afford to lose it. She'd been there in the jobs he'd taken at 4 in the morning and the ones he'd turned down because they conflicted with pickup. She'd been there in every single thing he'd decided to build and everything he'd decided not to. That afternoon, he called Lawrence Caldwell's office and left a message with the assistant saying he would not be moving forward with the acquisition. He expected to hear back quickly. He didn't expect what came instead. It started as friction. A municipal permit on the Lakeshore project that had been routine suddenly required additional engineering sign-offs. The subcontractor they'd been using for their electrical coordination stopped returning calls, then sent a brief email citing scheduling conflicts. A reference that had agreed to support their Carlton bid quietly withdrew, citing nothing specific. It was the kind of pattern that had no single piece you could point to, no one thing you could call deliberate. But Garrett had been in this industry long enough to know the difference between bad luck and applied pressure. He called Portia into his office and closed the door. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said. She laid it out carefully. The permit delay was not unusual on its own, but the timing was. The subcontractor had worked with them on 4 consecutive jobs without interruption. The Carlton reference had been enthusiastic as recently as 2 weeks ago. Taken individually, each item was explainable. Taken together, they formed a shape. "Caldwell Group has relationships with the permit authority," she said. "Not direct, but structural. 2 of their major development partners sit on the review board." Garrett nodded slowly. "And the subcontractor?" "Did 2 projects with a Caldwell subsidiary last year." He sat back in his chair. Outside the window, the lakeshore frame was standing exactly where it should be. Exactly on schedule, built by people who had shown up every morning and done the work properly because they believed it mattered. And somewhere 14 floors above an Ottawa street, someone was making phone calls that were designed to make that work harder to sustain. He felt something solidify in his chest. Not anger. Anger was too bright, too loud, too easy to act on recklessly. This was something steadier. The awareness that this was now a different kind of problem than the one he'd walked into. He spent the next 3 nights at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, working through something he had been sitting on for over a year. A structural analysis methodology he and Kwame had been quietly developing, a proprietary approach to seismic assessment and load prediction on complex multi-phase builds that was, as far as either of them could determine, not being done anywhere else in the country at their level of precision. They hadn't published it. They hadn't licensed it. They had been waiting until the conditions were right to bring it forward. Garrett had always understood in the abstract that this methodology was valuable. He understood it differently now, not as an asset to be positioned eventually, but as leverage in the present tense. He made calls he hadn't made before, to a structural engineering faculty contact at the University of Waterloo who had been asking about their methodology for 2 years. To the infrastructure lead at a federal crown corporation who had tried to poach Kwame 8 months ago and settled for having Garrett's mobile number instead. To a project finance group in Toronto that had been circling their firm quietly, without the acquisition intent of Caldwell, just with genuine interest in what they were building and where it was going. He did not announce any of this. He moved quietly the way the Caldwell Group had moved because he had learned something useful in that boardroom on Elgin Street. Patience and silence were not the same as weakness. They could be the opposite. 3 weeks after he declined the offer, he received another letter. Same heavy cream envelope, same embossed crest, but when he opened this one, the tone was different in a way that was immediately legible, more careful, more searching, a request for a follow-up conversation to discuss potential structures that might better address mutual interests. Garrett read it once, set it on the desk, called Darren in. "We're going back," he said. Darren raised an eyebrow. "What changed?" "The conversation," Garrett said. "The boardroom was the same. The view over the Rideau Canal was the same. But when Garrett walked in this time, he didn't wait to be directed to a seat. He pulled out the chair directly across from Lawrence Caldwell and sat down before anyone extended an invitation. The room noticed. Lawrence had brought different people this time. In addition to Renata, there were 2 additional faces Garrett didn't recognize, introduced briefly as senior partners. The composition itself was information. They had reinforced, which meant they had recalibrated. Garrett had brought Portia. He let the room settle for a moment, then placed a folder on the table and slid it forward, unhurried. "Before we talk terms," he said, "I want you to understand what you were actually looking at when you valued our firm." Renata's eyes dropped to the folder. She opened it with the practiced calm of someone who read numbers for a living, and was not easily surprised by them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up. "This is your seismic assessment methodology?" "Partially," Garrett said. "That's the summary documentation. The full IP is protected and currently under formal review by 2 federal infrastructure bodies and a research partnership with Waterloo. The licensing value alone, conservatively modeled, changes your acquisition math significantly." A short silence. "You didn't disclose this in the initial meeting," Lawrence said. "You didn't ask about anything beyond what was in our financials," Garrett replied, even. "And you had already decided what our company was worth before I walked in the door." Lawrence absorbed that without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. Renata turned pages. The numbers were doing their work. Garrett could see it in the way her pace slowed as she moved through the document. The university validation, the Crown Corporation interest, The licensing framework Porsche had helped him build out over the past 3 weeks. "This shifts the conversation," Renata said finally, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite deference, but its near neighbor. "That's why I came back," Garrett said. Lawrence leaned forward. His hands were still folded. His voice was still measured. But the angle of the conversation had changed, and all of them knew it. "What would you need? To revisit a structure?" Garrett looked at him steadily. "Full retention of my senior team, named specifically in the agreement, not subject to review, not subject to restructuring. A performance partnership model where operational decisions on any project originating from our portfolio require my sign-off for a minimum of 3 years. And licensing of the methodology stays with Morrow Structural, not with the acquiring entity." Lawrence was quiet for a moment. "That's a substantial departure from our standard model." "Your standard model was built for firms that come to you," Garrett said. "I didn't come to you." Another silence. Longer this time. Renata looked at her father. The look wasn't asking permission. It was assessing consensus. Lawrence exhaled slowly. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be." Garrett shook his head, almost gently. "No, I've made it exactly what it should be." The meeting ended without a signed agreement, but it ended differently than the first one. As Garrett and Portia gathered their documents, Renata walked around the table toward him, her hand extended. "You gave us something we weren't expecting," she said. "Not quite an apology. Not quite admiration. Somewhere between them. You gave me a reason to find it," Garrett said, and shook her hand. In the elevator on the way down, Portia said nothing for the first 2 floors. Then, "They'll come back." "I know," Garrett said. "On your terms?" "Closer to them." She nodded once. "Good enough." He drove back to the site. Darren and Megan were at the trailer with coffee when he got there, not pretending they hadn't been watching the clock. "How'd it go?" Darren asked. Garrett pulled off his blazer and hung it over the back of the chair. "We're still standing," he said, "and they know why." He told them the outline, not everything, but enough. What was in the folder, what he'd asked for, what they'd said, and what the silence after it meant. And when he got to the part about the personnel retention clause, named specifically in the agreement, Megan set down her coffee cup and didn't say anything, but she was looking at him in a way that said she had heard the part that mattered. Kwame, who had been leaning against the doorframe, said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Garrett said, and left it there. That evening he got home at a reasonable hour for once, early enough that dinner wasn't reheated, early enough that Lily was still at the table doing homework rather than already in the bath. She looked up when he came in with the particular attention she paid him when she was trying to determine what kind of day it had been. He sat down across from her and helped himself to a clementine from the bowl in the center of the table and started peeling it. "You seem different," she said. "Better different or worse different?" She considered this seriously. "Just different," she said. "Like something happened. Something did. Was it the polite, mean people?" He smiled. "Yeah, what happened to them?" He thought about how to answer that, what version of it was true in a way a 7-year-old could hold. "They found out they didn't understand what they were trying to buy," he said. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to her homework. He peeled the clementine all the way and set half of it on the edge of her notebook without saying anything, because she always wanted some and never asked, and she took a piece without looking up, which was exactly how they did things. After dinner, he washed the dishes and she dried them, standing on the small step stool she'd been using since she was tall enough to reach the counter, handing each dish back in the careful, serious way she'd always done it, as if drying a plate were something that deserved to be done correctly. When they were done, she went to her backpack and pulled out a drawing she'd been working on and brought it to the kitchen table with the slight ceremonial air she sometimes had when she was presenting something she thought was important. It was the same building from the earlier drawing, but more detailed now. Windows, a door, something that might have been a crane on the left side. And this time the 2 figures had grown slightly, both of them still connected by the line she'd drawn between them, but standing a little straighter, a little more deliberately placed. She'd written something new above them. Still standing. He looked at it for a long time. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. She shrugged with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who didn't fully understand the weight of what they'd said and didn't need to. "It just felt right," she said. He pinned the drawing to the corkboard above the kitchen desk, next to the permit schedule and the project milestone chart where it stayed for weeks. Not because he forgot to move it. Because every morning when he stood at the counter with his coffee going over the day's priorities, it said something that the permit schedule and the milestone chart couldn't say. It said they were still there, that what they'd built had held, that the people he'd chosen to build it with were still where they were supposed to be. The Caldwell Group came back 6 weeks later with a revised structure. Not everything Garrett had asked for, but close. The personnel clause was in. The methodology licensing stayed with Morrow Structural. The operational sign-off period was 2 years instead of 3, and that was a negotiation he was willing to have. He brought it to his senior team before he signed anything. Laid it out the same way he'd laid out the original offer, plainly without editorializing, and let them read it. When they were done, Darren looked up and said, "This is different." "Yeah," Garrett said. "How different would it have been if you'd said yes the first time?" Garrett looked at the table for a moment. "We wouldn't be in this room having this conversation," he said. Nobody needed to add anything to that. The night after the deal closed, he sat with Lily on the couch while she worked on a new drawing, something elaborate involving horses and what appeared to be a castle. And he watched the Ottawa news on low volume with the sound barely up, half present in the way that felt like the most honest kind of rest. She leaned against his arm after a while, the way she did when she was getting sleepy, but wasn't ready to admit it. He reached over and adjusted the blanket around her without breaking whatever thread of attention she had left on the drawing. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Cars and lights and the river moving in the dark past the buildings his firm had helped put there, and the ones they were going to help put there next, on terms that he had set, carrying people who had chosen to stay because he had made it worth staying. He looked down at Lily. Her eyes were closing. "Dad," she said, still mostly asleep. "Yeah. Are you still building things?" "Yeah," he said. "We are." She made a small satisfied sound and pressed closer, the drawing sliding off her lap onto the cushion beside her. He left it there, turned off the television, sat in the quiet for a while longer, not because there was anything left to resolve, but because it was the first night in a long time where the quiet felt like something that had been earned.